Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Nick Davies, and I'm a Programme Director here. Well-planned economic infrastructure, by which I mean transport, energy, utilities, digital communication, can play a critical role in solving some of the key challenges facing the UK economy at the moment, such as stagnant productivity and regional inequality. And it's for that reason that the Institute over the last 18 months has undertaken a major programme of work looking at how we can make better quality decisions on infrastructure. We've published 7 reports, with the most recent report out this morning, that looks specifically at the role of ministers, how they can ask better questions of their civil servants, how they can provide better direction, and ultimately how they can make better decisions. One of the key issues that we've picked up across our work is how we can take a more long-term and evidence-based approach to infrastructure policymaking. Too often in the UK, infrastructure decision-making has been characterised by inconsistency, constant change, and has been driven by short-term political considerations. And it was for this exact reason that the National Infrastructure Commission was established, to try and help overcome these persistent problems. We think the NIC has got off to a really strong start. It's published some well-received work on cross-cutting issues like smart power and on area-specific developments like the Cambridge, Milton Keynes and Oxford corridor. But its primary responsibility and its most important job is to publish once every 5 years a national infrastructure assessment. And the first one of these was published last week. And that takes a 30-year look ahead at the country's infrastructure needs and made recommendations on transport, low carbon energy, flooding, digital networks, as well as some of the key components of how decisions are made, such as economic appraisal, devolution to cities, financing, and funding. This is a great opportunity to try and fix some of those persistent weaknesses in infrastructure decision-making in the UK. But in order to take advantage of that opportunity, it's critical that the government gets their response right. So what should the government's response look like? How can the policies and projects on infrastructure be better coordinated across Whitehall and the wider public sector? What should we be prioritising? And how can we ensure that the National Infrastructure Assessment really is a catalyst for taking a more long-term approach to infrastructure policymaking? To answer these questions and more, I'm joined by this stellar panel. First up will be Sir John Armitt, who is Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, as well as the National Express Group, the City and Guilds Group, and the Thames Estuary 2050 Commission. His former roles include Chief Executive of Network Rail and Chairman of the Olympic Delivery Authority. And it was also his review in 2013 which recommended the creation of the National Infrastructure Commission. Next up will be Stephen Hammond, the MP for Wimbledon, who's also chair of the all-party parliamentary group on infrastructure. He was the Minister for Transport between 2012 and 2014, previously working as the Shadow Transport Minister from 2005 to 2010. And Steve's going to have to leave a little bit early. As you may have noticed, he's been quite busy in the last couple of days and needs to run off to Millbank. And finally, we have Sara, who's the Chief Executive of the Association for Project Management. She's previously been Managing Director of the Royal Town Planning Institute and has held Managing Director roles at the Home Builders Federation and the Trademark Owners Association, as well as Director roles at Thames Television and Penguin Books. And we're particularly grateful to Sara and the Association for Project Management for supporting both this event and this morning's publication on the role of ministers in infrastructure decision-making. So in format for the day, the speakers are each going to make introductory comments. I'm going to then ask them a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sir John Armitt.
Well, thank you, Nick. And Nick's managed to cover quite a few of the things I was going to say. Quick response is, what should the government's reaction be? Well, just accept the recommendations and let's move on. So what I'll do is I'll just add a little flesh to some of those recommendations. The one which has inevitably possibly caused more comment was the one related to energy. We haven't, as has been reported in some areas, said that we should now see the end of nuclear. What we have said is that we believe that, looking at the evidence, that by 2050 you could see a energy and electricity program which was based fundamentally on renewables for the same price as one which has a much heavier nuclear component along the lines of what has previously been suggested. The renewables program requires a greater investment in the distribution network and in the smart systems which are required to support a renewables program, and so the extra cost which goes in there matches some of the extra, offsets the extra costs that you would see with the nuclear program. The other optimistic thing that we believe is evidenced is that it's easier to believe that in fact the renewables program and renewables systems will come down in cost. Now, part of the nuclear argument is, well, yes, we can expect to see significant reductions in nuclear as well. There is no evidence of that, either in this country or anywhere else around the world. So I think the challenge there is very much, well, on what basis can one believe that there's going to be a 30% reduction in the building of nuclear power stations? It's much easier to believe that there's likely to be a continued reduction, as we've seen already, in the cost of renewables. So we're saying for the same amount of money, and in fact for the same electricity, cost of electricity as you are seeing today, which is roughly £1,850 per household, you could hold that price in 2050, so it need not cost you anymore. There's the other matter of heat, and on heat we've said that you've only got two choices really at the end of the day if you're going to decarbonise. One is to have a system based on hydrogen. The other is to have one based on electricity. If it's electricity, it's likely to be heat pumps that we would have rather than gas boilers in our homes. If it's hydrogen, obviously it would be a hydrogen boiler rather than a gas boiler as we have today. Difficulty with that is that at the moment the hydrogen itself as a system is something to be proven, that you can store and transport it effectively and safely, and equally how you're going to produce it in the first place, and fundamentally the only way you're likely to do that on scale is with carbon capture storage, which is another system which is yet to be demonstrated at scale. So we've recommended that government should actually be willing to support significant trials in both of those systems over the next 10 years to get to a point where there can be a lot more confidence about whether that will work, or if it doesn't, then we're going to face the need for greater electrification of heat. On waste, we've fundamentally said let's recycle more and incinerate less, or landfill less. So we've proposed a series of targets. Wales at the moment manages to separate out and recycle 90% of its food waste. In England it's 45%. It seems odd that in England we can't manage to achieve the same thing with the benefits which flow from that, both in the efficiency of the recycling of other materials through incineration, and of course with your food waste you get the opportunity for producing methane gas through a biodigestion system. We've said let's separate food waste by 2025 to sort of very much higher percentages than we manage today. Let's recycle 65% of plastics, recycle 65% of everything and 75% of plastics by 2030. And let's restrict the use sooner than that of some of the key plastics such as PVC and polystyrene. So setting targets for those. On digital, we've fundamentally, in line with already many government and proposals and Ofcom proposals, which is let's focus on fibre and let's have 100% fibre across the country to the households, to the premises by 2033. and let's make sure that we support the remoter and rural areas, and let's do that up front rather than at the end, so almost start from the outside in. So government needs to support the more rural areas from the beginning. The private sector will undoubtedly, as we already see in London and elsewhere, be happy to install fibre on a competitive basis. You will get to a point where it becomes challenging for the private sector to do it, and that we suspect and we suggest will be found in a sense by a sort of natural fallout system of the degree to which the private sector is and sees the benefit of installing fibre but on a competitive basis, and the point at which you have to start to provide some government support. And as Philip Hammond has already said yesterday, we recommended that we get to a date by which it is possible to switch off from copper. On transport, we've focused on electrification of cars, which we believe our view is more optimistic, or more challenging perhaps than the Department of Transport. They've been talking about 50 to 70% of new sales by 2030. We believe that could be 100% of new sales by 2030. But that will only happen if you remove range anxiety, and that requires government to work with Ofwat and others to ensure, sorry, not Ofwat, Ofgem and others to ensure that we've got in place a charging network across the country. It requires local authorities to step up and be willing to make 20% of their car parking spaces available for electricity charging. It requires all new homes to be set up so that people can buy an electric car and be able to plug it in. So there's a series of measures to support the electrification of cars. Elsewhere on transport, and it's wrapped up in a sense with a wider proposal we've made about devolution of financial powers to local authorities. So we've said that the major cities, the mayors, should actually have 5-year funding programs to be able to make their decisions about what is the infrastructure or the transport systems that they believe are right for their city, and the government should devolve money to them on a 5-yearly cycle. For the very large schemes which were required by cities, then there would obviously still need to be more of an agreement between government and those cities as to what can be and can't be funded. In total, we've suggested £43 billion by 2040 being made available to local government for transport systems. You might say, where's that money come from? Well, the government's given us a fiscal remit of 1.2% of GDP. As you get beyond 2025 and 2030, you can start to see headroom in that, in the availability of money. And so it's roughly on average 2 billion a year, but back-end loaded fundamentally, that support for local government on their transport systems. On drought and flood, we produced a paper a couple of months ago now, particularly to tie in with other papers which were being produced at the time by DEFRA. We've said that the water companies, and it's rather, I suppose, topical today, but we've said that the water companies should reduce leakage by 50% by 2050. But we've said that won't be enough, that there'll need to be water transfer systems or extra capacity as well to create the buffer of roughly 4 billion litres a day which would be needed to see us through a severe drought situation in the future. On flooding, we've said that we think it would be, rather than have the sort of hit and miss approach we have at the moment where everybody rushes out after a flood event and seeks to fix everything for a couple of years and then retreats, and then 3 years later, 5 years later, we're all out there again in our Wellington boots. It would be much better if we adopted a standard approach to this. And so we've suggested probability levels which should be adopted, 2 different levels, one for cities and one for other areas. Clearly the impact and the financial benefit of having that protection in cities is a lot greater than it is in other areas, and therefore you can afford to take a higher probabilistic approach to that. So we're saying a 0.1% probability in the cities and a 0.5% probability elsewhere. And I think those are the main areas. The other one point we've made is that we think good design is fundamental to good infrastructure. And we've said that we think all major projects should have a design panel, and that as at the NIC, we're prepared to sort of hold the ring on that and set out some principles of good design which should be adopted, and that every major project should have its design champion. Sadie Morgan, who's one of our commissioners, fulfills that role at the moment for High Speed 2. You know, if you say, well, what's a good example of this, I would simply point to the Jubilee Line stations in London. You know, they are something which we have every reason to be proud of, and you know that they lift the soul. I think you go down into Canary Wharf Station, it's like going into a cathedral, and that is good design. It's effective, it works, but it also provides a lift to you in your daily life, and that's what infrastructure should be doing as much as being simply functional. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I think I was asked to comment on how the government should react to this. I see you're publishing a report, How to be a Minister Making Decisions on Infrastructure. I suspect that won't be required reading for me after the last few days. But how should the government react? Well, I think the government should accept that one of its great triumphs was actually setting up a National Infrastructure Commission in this area. For far too long, as this report and others of numerous reports have pointed out, there has been a rather like our economic policy, infrastructure policy was the same stop-go cycles. And the National Infrastructure Commission was set up with a very attempt to overcome that and then produce an executable plan. And therefore it seems to me the government should do three things. It should react to it, and I think there are a number of ways it needs to react to it. First of all, if this plan is to be in any way achievable, then government needs to react institutionally. Government is badly set up for long-term planning. There are silo mentalities still in the way departments are set up, so infrastructure is handled by a number of departments. If you sit in a cabinet committee, although they're trying to achieve one project quite often in that committee, what you find is the competing departments are actually wanting to put their own ends first. The other thing, of course, is that there has, with the exception of two ministers under George Osborne, there's never really been an infrastructure minister with any status which could pull those departments together or be the driver for big projects inside government. People are generally sceptical about setting up new departments, and I think that's probably right. But on the whole, an infrastructure minister of cabinet rank set inside the Treasury, I think would have the clout to overcome a number of the silo mentality. So the first thing I think the government needs to do is to look at its own institutional processes to ensure that what is in this report could actually be deliverable. The second thing I think the government needs to look at is, because this report challenges it in a number of ways, the detail of which Sir John has just set out, but also the government is a very bad client on the whole. What the government tends to try and do is over-design and over-specify a project right at the beginning rather than going to experts. And so I think the second key thing the government needs to do institutionally is to actually recognise it needs to become a more intelligent client, and it should take the advice from experts as how to do so. But in a lot of cases it should actually accept what's in the report and then actually go out to the experts and say, how should we deliver this, rather than allowing teams of civil servants, most of whom are very clever, intelligent people, to design something, specify it. Let's get experts in earlier, would be my second point, to say making the government an intelligent client. And what this report also does is challenge, I think, on financing, not just the devolution aspect, but we look at projects in the UK, infrastructure projects, in a quite a bizarre way. If we were in the commercial world, you'd never look at them like this. The current debate over Crossrail 2 is whether or not it can be funded during its build phase. This is a piece of infrastructure that is probably going to last for 75 years. Any normal business would amortise that over a much longer period. And one of the problems for government is it doesn't even have a notional balance sheet. So everything goes on debt and on borrowing. And there's no appreciation of the accretion to our national asset value. If there were even a notional balance sheet, you would actually look at the financing of projects in a very different way. So the very first thing this report does, it seems to me, is to challenge the government as to whether it's in any capacity to accept this report in terms of be able to do the next to accept this report. I think it should accept this report. I think Sir John has outlined a number of the issues. But actually, how is it then going to proceed? I think it needs to proceed by changing not only the culture inside government, but the culture outside government. And there are a number of those issues there today, because you've talked a little bit about good design. Good design is not an end in itself. Good design feeds into how infrastructure works, how broadband can work, and how people can live their lives. And all of this is not about infrastructure as an end in itself. It's about allowing people to have the jobs of the future, to live the lives of the future, to accept the way, to accept that there are links between people who do things. I was very struck about 5 years ago. I went to do a speech in Lincolnshire, and I was asked being speaking to some local businessmen in a relatively small market town. And they said, oh, we're all closing shop and moving to Peterborough. Why are you doing that? Well, we're doing that because there's no broadband here. We'd be happy. So the pressures on our infrastructure system in terms of transport, housing, water, energy, all the things that are because we don't make linked up decisions. And I think therefore the government first of all needs to change not only its culture but the culture of others and the culture of people who provide infrastructure so it can be provided in that way. And therefore the quality of design, we shouldn't just accept that quality of design is great for the cathedral of the Crossrail station or the Jubilee stations. It should also be true elsewhere across the country. I think the key, you've made some very key reports. I think you're right about electricity. I think one of the great challenges is going to be cultural again for the British public, accepting that there are going to be new ways for them to store and use energy. I remember having a conversation with Oliver Letwin about 10 years ago about how you increase the charging network across the UK. And at that stage we just suggested putting it on the regulated asset base and actually be provided by the private sector for the public sector. There are plenty of ways to solve these problems, but we need to think about them. But the public also, the change I think in some of the battery storage possibilities, and therefore how we use infrastructure, how we use energy, how we store energy, the type of energy we may be able to use is a challenge, and I think that will feed into this quite dramatically as well. And I think that we need, so therefore the other role of government is also pressing down culturally on the citizens of the country. You've mentioned electric cars, Sir John, and electric vehicles. Of course, the public have a scepticism at the moment, being told 15 years ago that diesel was the way forward. The number of people who now say, why the hell should I believe you about electric cars? You'll have something else in the very near future. So culturally, there's a real challenge for government as well to make sure that some of these recommendations that are undoubtedly right actually are picked up and driven on by them to impress upon the public that these are the needs of the trade. And my final point, I think, comes back to financing. Again, I think that I'm not going to challenge any of the reports, because I have to confess that given the events of the last few days, I've only read the executive summary rather than 200 reports. But it is waiting to join me on the beach somewhere this summer. But I think that the challenge on financing to the government is also key. We went from PPP to PFI projects and a number of, and then a mistrust of working with the private sector in financing. The issue, of course, is that there are different structures available for different projects. And what the government, one of the reasons why it became a dirty word was we used the same mechanism for every project. As any financier will tell you, there are any different numbers of structures that might be different and appropriate for these sorts of projects. And the Treasury, I think, has done a lot of thinking on this, but we need to see that thinking now coming out and backing this report, because it is that sort of thinking that will deliver this report for the British public.
Thank you. Sara.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. APM is the chartered body for the project profession, and we're really pleased to be supporting this event here this morning and this discussion. And we're also pleased with the hand we had in the report, which has been referred to already, about how to be an effective infrastructure minister. So, the objective of creating a long-term pipeline of relevant infrastructure, and of course from our perspective, better and more effective project management at its heart, is an important one for the country in social and economic terms. And this assessment, well, the creation of the NIC first and foremost, to give a more strategic and long-term approach to infrastructure investment, and now the launch of the assessment is a big step in the right direction. And Sir John obviously has covered a lot of the headline content, and I don't want to duplicate that, but what I would like to do is raise just a few thoughts, perhaps from some slightly different and still important angles. So for me, the key part of the report is the paragraph at the heart of the next steps section, where it says, infrastructure delivery depends on the availability of the right skills, the approach to construction and project management, the depth of the supply base, and the capability of government and other infrastructure owners and operators to act as an intelligent client. These are the responsibility of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which advises on infrastructure delivery. The UK's exit from the EU will impact the UK's skills base and supply chain, and there should be a strategic approach to managing this. So firstly, what I draw from the whole document is an acknowledgement of the increasing interconnectivity of the various strands. A rail project, no longer just a rail project. We can't go on building houses in isolation. We have to be clear that integrated strategies are needed for transport, for employment, for housing, right from the very start. And the report recognises, as Stephen has said, the dangers around siloed decision-making, the challenges, complexity, dependency, volatility, and we need to see infrastructure developments in really new and imaginative ways. I welcome the importance that the NIA places on the impact on society and individuals. It's no longer just a spreadsheet concern. And I also welcome the fact that infrastructure is now seen in that much broader sense rather than just the physical. Second, creating the conditions for a national consensus on major projects and also major policy themes. It's a pretty challenging task. It's probably not healthy, and indeed it's probably not realistic to think that everything can be harmonious, delivered rationally. But I do think that the NIC can play a really important role in creating the conditions for a robust national debate to achieve long-term consensus where that's possible. Third, absolutely critical, long-term projects require long-term vision, lasting plans, stable funding. And collectively, we need, as you have said, Stephen, to move away from that short-term approach, that siloed decision-making, and the resulting private sector lack of confidence in investment. And these have been for some time one of the major frustrations of the delivery professions. So longer-term policy and decision-making, absolutely essential, and that will result in better project inception, which we all know from our research is one of the critical factors in the ultimate success of the projects. Fourth, and back to that paragraph which I quoted about the importance of creating better and more effective infrastructure capacity, we must continue the task which is absolutely at the core of our profession at the moment, of improving the skills and the project leadership of all projects. And that will achieve better outcomes for society and for the economy, and not just on the old premise of delivering on time, on budget. I'm not saying that's not important, but it's no longer sufficient. And as I said last week in our initial response to the report obviously signals a step change in how critical infrastructure could be delivered. It will bolster our profession's delivery capability. A robust and skilled UK project profession with increasing numbers of chartered project professionals will be pivotal to success in delivering the strategy. The assessment is rightly thinking long term, but we must prime the pipeline now to build the skills, the capacity, the resilience to ensure successful delivery of the next generation of projects. And that's my advert for today, as you can imagine. But seriously, government and all stakeholders involved in infrastructure need to ensure that we plan and we invest for the skills required. And John Manzoni, head of the Civil Service, said this only recently, in fact, in this very room at a previous event. He pointed out that the seeds of this professionalism are growing and they are being recognised within government itself. So that's welcome. We also recognise the need to build capability in procurement and delivery at a regional level before launching major programmes there. And that's something which I think has not been really addressed in the past. I do believe we have a genuine opportunity here in the UK to become world leaders in this field. And finally, just a few words about partnership and collaboration. And again, I would echo that really important point that the Commission can't do this alone. Government, regulators, industry, citizens and others will all need to contribute to making this vision a reality. And that's whether it is the private sector innovating, whether it's the IPA offering an even stronger guiding hand from government, the metro mayors driving change at that regional level, professionals working across different sectors, learning and applying the lessons from the past. And yes, government should ensure publication of better data, more transparency on the costs and the benefits of major projects. Let's look at the success stories just as much as we look at the projects which go wrong. And in all this, effective partnership and collaboration is essential. And just finally, to congratulate Sir John on a really important report.
Brilliant, thank you. I think one of the key themes that's come up there from John and Sarah is the interconnectivity of these policies, and that making the most of them will ensure that they're working together. Yet, as Stephen points out, their work in government is often siloed. So we calculate there are 26 ministers in 8 different departments, all of whom have some sort of responsibility for infrastructure policy. So we absolutely agree that there is a role for a new infrastructure minister in the Treasury. But short of that, I wonder what panellists think that the government can do, and particularly the Treasury can do when responding to the NIA, to ensure that it is taking account and drawing together the existing plans of different departments, and that those are integrated with the recommendations that have been made in the NIA. So perhaps to you first, Sir John. So easy first question.
Yeah. Well, I think this is not just about Treasury, of course. And as Stephen has said, this is an across-government challenge. It's a challenge for different government departments. In Treasury sense, I think the idea of an infrastructure, we've had one in the past. Lord Dighton held that role, where you've got a minister in Treasury who has a specific responsibility to drive infrastructure. I think there's clearly a benefit to that. Having that person at the cabinet table, of course, is what really counts. If the individual is going to have any real clout. I think the challenge for Treasury, as always, will be the financing of this. The public sector directly finances road, rail, and flood control. The rest comes from the private sector. And so therefore that sets a whole series of much wider policy challenges for regulators and for government in determining how you are able to encourage. Last night I was at a discussion on regulation, and as the NIC we're going to be doing a piece of work on the effectiveness of regulation going forward. But that is going to be quite crucial in enabling the investment levels to be developed, where you've got a right balance between short-term price to the consumer and the long-term consumer. What are the benefits to the long-term consumer and the investment that's needed to meet the long-term infrastructure requirements? I think if we can get less siloed thinking across government, then that is clearly going to be of benefit and is a crucial part of this. The consensus building is going to be extremely important. We intend to essentially during the autumn get ourselves out on a roadshow, but I mean the consensus building will need to be a lot longer than that. We did quite a lot of work with Ipsos Murray trying to get the public engaged in these infrastructure issues, because You know, you can't, as I've said in the past, you can't separate politics from infrastructure. And if the public are not supporting or understanding the implications of different approaches, then it's very difficult for ministers to actually get out and start demanding change if they can see that this is not going to be something which is acceptable to voters. So opening up the public debate, I think, is as important in this as opening up government. Finally, just in response to what Sara was saying at the end there is 1,000 miles to go by government in understanding the concept of collaboration. It does not. There is very little evidence, I would argue, that government in the procurement of projects really understands what is required. It is still far, far too rigid in its thinking and does not really understand the concept of real collaboration, which is necessary to get the right balance of risk sharing. I made comments last week about the rail franchise system. At City and Guilds, we are seeking to bid for T-levels, which will be the new technical levels at A-levels in schools. The attitude of government is very fundamentally, we're not interested in your opinions, it's take it or leave it, sit down, accept these regulations which we are going to put forward and the way this is going to be bid. And I've certainly got to the point where you say, why are we bothering? This is just not worth our while. We will bother because we care about technical training. But the government's approach, it's up here, John Manzoni and senior people understand what we're talking about. As in any large organisation, get that down into the middle layers, the tundra of the organisation where all new thinking is frozen, then that is a massive management challenge and one which I think government has really got to get to grips with if it's going to change things.
Stephen.
Well, I think John's last point is true, and it's true of so many corporate and governmental structures. I mean, I do a lot of work, the other area I do a lot of work is in financial services. You know, the FCA gets it at the top level, but you know, the next level down, it's frustrating British financial services, and it seems to be designed to do that. The organisation of which he was once chief executive is well known for its innovative thinking at the top level. It's not entirely true either at the next level down or either level after that, but we'll come in. I'm sure we'll come in. But the challenge back to government, so I mean, I've set out, obviously, I think there should be an infrastructure minister. I did at one stage about 3 or 4 years ago write a paper with the ACA on actually having an infrastructure ministry, but I accept that's always not popular. But I wrote a report with the Housing and Financing Institute last year about how do you get all the services in one place at one time. And actually, what that challenge was not only and I'll come back to the cross-government challenge, but the up and down challenge in terms of the levers of government. And John's obviously touched on this in his report in City Mayors. But how do you make sure that the decision-making for particular projects are taken at the right level, and there is enough information and expertise at that right level, and people understand what those projects were and what they drive? About 5 years ago, the Department for Transport did a small road scheme which was designed, you could only bid for it if it was on safety or growth. Most of the schemes were growth, and they were only there was 150 million in the pot, and I think the maximum you could bid for was 8 million. But what that unlocked around the country was incredibly successful. So I think the other thing that we need to think about quite carefully is making sure whether or not the decisions are being taken at the right level and whether we have the expertise to take them at the right level. And then going back to the cross-government thinking, I mean, I think the government will have to think very carefully about whether the way it's organised can work. And I think it will also have to accept that it needs more experts in it. Sara spoke a few minutes ago, as I have in my remark, about intelligent client. I think there's a widespread perception that the National Infrastructure Commission is working well and has worked well. Again, across government, I'm not sure there's a widespread perception that the IPA is actually delivering on its objectives, and maybe the government needs to rethink whether or not that organisation needs some form of change to drive those projects forward.
Thank you. I mean, yes, I agree with much of what you said, but at the end of the day, what the Treasury needs is confidence in project outcomes. And that's about confidence that benefits will be realised as much as investment will be managed appropriately. Yes, it's important that we do much more to develop sponsorship capability, the intelligent client piece. I think the IPA is doing a good job at the moment. I accept that its remit, in a sense, is perhaps narrower than one would like to see, but there's a huge amount of work going on in there in terms of upskilling in this area. It's interesting to see the real developments in terms of project management apprentices, for instance, which is completely bucking the trend on apprenticeships at the moment, and indeed the demand for places on the civil service fast stream for project management. I mean, there is no doubt there is a real commitment and recognition around that. I come back every time to the need for that longer term decision making, that real understanding that you can't do this on a short term basis and have confidence, A, that you attract the private sector investment, and B, that your project outcomes will be as you initially expect them to be.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time. Can I please ask that they are indeed questions and not statements? And can I please ask that you keep it relatively short so that as many people have an opportunity as possible? And I think there are a couple of people with microphones. So let's take the two down here at the front.
Hi, Dan Slade from the Royal Town Planning Institute. So one of the, I think, the concluding points in the IFG's recent report on this subject around ministers was about the levels of churn we experience in infrastructure ministers. So in planning and housing, it's a serious problem, but also in transport and more broadly as well. And I think a major reason for that churn is the incentive structures around moving jobs, trying to get promoted faster into positions which are seen as being more influential or more powerful. So how do we fix them within the system?
Thank you.
And Peter Campbell from Westbourne Communications, probably more directed at Sir John, given the NIC and the National Infrastructure Assessment. But I'm just wondering, what regrets are there around the NIA? Is there anything in there, not in there, that you wish was in there? And likewise, I suppose, for the other two, are there things in the NIA, or are there not things in the NIA that you would like to have seen in there as well?
Thank you. So that's a question from Dan about how do we reduce churn amongst minister, and from Peter about regrets. I'm going to give John a little time to think about that question. So perhaps if I come to Stephen first on how we reduce churn amongst ministers.
It's been a nice morning. Thank you for having me. I think it's a really good question because, as you know, we've just had the 8th housing minister in, I think, less than 8 years. I think there's an issue, obviously, of people involved in politics and MPs. They recognise the chance of being in government gives you the chance to influence things, the chance to do things. But we have a slightly perverse structure. There's very, very little stability, and I think it's not an easy challenge to overcome because governments change first of all, which is the first point. So even in most stable governments, and I have to confess that the Cameron government and the Cameron administration of the Conservative Party from 2006 through to about 2014 was a relatively stable administration. You know, people would get. So I was shadow opposition transport minister for 4.5 years, and then went in as a transport minister thereafter. So David, I think, had tried to do that for a lot of people in opposition and then moved into government positions. It obviously changed slightly because of the coalition, but it's a formidable challenge. There was absolutely no need, for instance, to move the recent housing minister. He could have stayed there for a longer time, in my opinion. And I think that it's something that, it's probably the point I should have made, which is that government, I think, needs to challenge itself about whether it needs so many movements. But then you have ambitious people in who want to be government ministers, so they can do that. It's easier in a corporate structure to actually overcome. I mean, I've worked in many corporate structures. It's probably easier to overcome and move people's ambitions around than it is in government. But playing to what Sarah's lead about not only the need for long-term planning, the long-term stability at the head of who's sponsoring those projects. It's true, but I'm not sure there's any easy solution to that question, I'm afraid.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, on that question, I think one of the differences in corporate world is that there is possibly a greater consensus around policy and strategy, which you're able to keep going. And that, yes, there are movements below that, and so you might change executive directors in an organisation, but in fact the underlying, and it's more than about delivery. And I think the big problem for government is that, you know, the juiciest jobs in the civil service, and why are you a minister in the first place, largely not about delivery, more about policy. And that's the dilemma, I think, that there is what you get with change of minister. And if you're working closely with government, you know, the first question you ask yourself is, well, what's this going to mean for the policy? Is the new minister in the same government, let alone in a different policy, in a different party, but is that new minister actually going to have the same views on policy? And that's what creates the uncertainty, is this constant shift of policy and a complete, you know, not complete, but deliveries, the deliverers are the second-class citizens in government, and that I think is a fundamental weakness of you know, actually taking forward policy. So there just isn't the focus on the detail in policy, and then that all gets shaken out, and then it actually undermines the policy, of course, when people actually realise the complexity of the detail. Regrets about what we've done? Yeah, at the moment, not too many. I think the regret will be if, in fact, we're unable in the longer term to actually see these policies being delivered. And that's what we've got to clearly all work on, is to make sure that the pressure is maintained and the arguments are maintained to ensure it. There are some interesting things which are, in a sense, in the document which don't get headlines particularly, but which are very important for the future. We didn't go overly strongly on the whole issue of how do we pay for our motoring in the future. It's there in the report. It's one of the most important things. We chose not to make it a headline because we saw no benefit in doing that at this stage, but it's one of the things which has got to be picked up. The electrification of cars means the loss of £30 billion worth a year of revenue to the Treasury. Where's that going to come from? And how do we, in the future, pay for our motoring? Because we can't just have it 30 billion cheaper. And so we've got that I think is a fundamental question for the future. And I don't regret the decision we made, but I think it's one of those things which is in there, but which will require a lot more debate.
Sara?
I don't think I've got
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. I think firstly this gentleman here, and then this gentleman over here. The front here is great.
John Burt, House of Lords. I worked at number 10 between 2000 and 2005. I led a large team of DFT, Cabinet Office, Treasury officials looking at our national transport infrastructure, identified a 50-year problem, identified clearly we had the worst transport infrastructure by far of any leading country, looked at root causes. Over 50 years, a far smaller proportion of GDP invested in infrastructure than any other country, a constant picture under all government of stop-start. The second there was the financial crisis, immediately cutting back on capital spending. I strongly support the drive of what Stephen Hammond was saying, but would like to press him a little further. We concluded that the root cause problem was the culture of the Treasury. It wasn't about individual governments, it wasn't about individual ministers, it was the attitude of mind. The Treasury is like a badly run small business, focuses on short-term results, does not invest in long-term gain. So yes, possibly an infrastructure minister in the Treasury would change the psychology, but is that enough?
And over here.
Well, Nick, thank you very much. I think having traveled farthest to this event and adjusted my program to be here, you probably indulge me to speak a bit longer. My name is Chidi Izuwa, and I'm from the Infrastructure Regulatory Commission from Nigeria. I'd just like to commend, Sir John for the wonderful work his commission has done. And if you don't mind, we look forward to copying shamelessly from you to improve Nigeria. My question is really about the infrastructure minister stuff. Is it going to work? Infrastructure is multidisciplinary. I mean, we elect prime ministers and presidents for a purpose. Shouldn't the infrastructure minister in a government be the prime minister or the president? Who has the power of coordination? Because if you put somebody at a lateral level with other ministers with no political authority, to get compliance, it's just going to be another, sense of tension, that just creates, silos and, a cycle of work. Now, if that fails, maybe what we need is some infrastructure whip in government, who goes around whipping people just to make them, put them into shape.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Stephen Hoss quickly because I know he has to run.
Well, responding directly to John Burt's question, I think clearly an infrastructure minister is not enough, and he is right, changing the mentality of the Treasury. I remember one of the great battles which we actually in the end managed to win was getting a 4-year funding cycle for the Highways Agency back in 2013. Prior to that, road spending in this country had been done on an annual basis and annual basis only. So the long-term commitment, so they couldn't change, because the Treasury likes to control the purse strings year by year, getting them to commit to long-term projects and therefore long-term funding streams is very difficult, and changing that mentality. And that's why I think it is important to have the minister inside the Treasury, because it can batter against that. So that's one of the reasons why I make the point I think it needs to be inside the Treasury. And you are absolutely right, the mentality of the Treasury. So I go back to my point I made in my earlier remarks. But you wouldn't know, you shouldn't be trying to fund projects over a 5-year lifestyle when they have 100 years of worth. I mean, it's just the government needs to change in the Treasury, and so I will go back and reread your stuff from that period, because I think it is instructive and pardon? Well then you can, like all good politicians, you can leak it to the appropriate source. And I think to the gentleman over here, I think you need. I disagree. I don't think the president, whilst the president of the country or the prime minister of the country is the chief executive of the country, to use the analogy, and it may well be that they're committed to certain projects and see those as want to press their imprimatur on them. The execution for the policy and also for driving the execution has to be someone underneath that. Having a prime minister or a president that's committed to that is key, I think, and giving the power to someone. I absolutely agree, but I don't think they should be the person doing it. I think they should be the support, the mentor, the drive.
Right.
And I apologise, I have to head off.
Stephen. Oh, sorry. What's your job?
I don't disagree with what Stephen has just said. I mean, I've always said that on very large projects, they will never happen until you've got the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in support. In High Speed 1, Channel Tunnel Rail Link was a classic example of that. Some people may remember the sort of, I don't think it was apocryphal really, but Mitterrand came over and said that he had sped across the plains of France and ambled through the orchards of Kent. Margaret Thatcher, almost the following day, having been clearly stung by this, announced that she was now going to support the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, and it moved, and everything happened from there on. And you can see, in a sense, with High Speed 2, Andrew Adonis was able to garner the support of David Cameron and George Osborne, and that essentially got that project moving in the way that it did. It moved far more rapidly than others have.
So thoughts on the culture of the Treasury or the role of the Prime Minister?
Well, as far as the Treasury is concerned, it would just be so much easier, wouldn't it, if the Treasury understood the implications of those short-term decisions, the changes of policy, and felt more accountable for project outcomes, because there is no doubting the linkage between failing projects and the difficulties of getting good project inception as a result of long-term policy and decision making. And I think a better understanding that this is not just about finance, this is about an understanding of the wider economic and social benefits and what we're trying to deliver here. In terms of infrastructure minister, well, I would say I would agree, but we have to start somewhere, and I think this is a good place. What we really want is that much wider debate with all those who are key stakeholders in the development and delivery of infrastructure to be engaged in that debate, for those policy discussions to happen much more widely And if an infrastructure minister can help facilitate that, then worth doing.
Fantastic. I'm going to take 2 more quick questions. So there's a gentleman in the pink shirt there.
Hi, Martin Hurst, UCL. In 20 years as a senior civil servant on infrastructure, the only thing I found harder than getting long-term decisions on infrastructure was getting decisions on road pricing, accepting that water bills are too low fundamentally, and that on floods we need to help some communities move rather than protect them. How do we build a long-term plan for infrastructure and demand for infrastructure?
And one more here, just at the front in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Peter Armitt from the Whitehall and Industry Group, and previously Director General at DEFRA. Just a quick question on your views on how government prioritises financially between projects in terms of cost-benefit analysis and other models. And if you look, Stephen's left, but if you look just at transport, we have a system where there's some very bizarre incentives about how people travel from A to B via road, rail or air. And therefore, have we got the pricing decisions on infrastructure right to give people the right incentives for how they live and work?
Okay, so there's a question on demand and prioritisation between projects, and if I could ask the panellists to also use this opportunity for any final comments that they'd like to make to wrap up. So to you.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand your final point.
Well, the question up there is how do you build a long-term plan for infrastructure?
Yeah.
Because the question is what's the role of demand management in that plan?
Well, I think the challenge for demand management flows through a whole series of different. I mean, you can financially incentivize people, can't you? And you can, as we've seen with congestion charging, we've seen the success of water metering, which is not compulsory, but is encouraged. The water companies estimate the 17% reduction in demand as a consequence of water metering. I mean, I strongly believe that, that in fact, the more you can encourage people to understand what their use of something is costing them, then the more they're likely to regulate that behaviour. I mean, we've I didn't reference it earlier on. I mean, we've suggested a £3.8 billion support for a programme of insulation and further reduction or improvement in the efficiency of homes. I mean, that has proved to be one of the most difficult challenges of all that we've faced in recent years in this country. The Green Deal didn't work. Didn't work because the government Treasury wanted to charge commercial rates of interest for people to borrow money to invest in their homes, which they're not going to do quite clearly, particularly with a long payback and an average period of dwelling of 7 years. So we've suggested that in the first place we have to start on social housing and get that fixed before you move and try and solve the problem in private housing. But I think financial incentives are more likely to influence demand than anything else. And that's potentially the challenge of road pricing, which, as you say, has been not around for a long time. The great thing about modern technology is that we could literally be paying by the minute, by the type of road that we are travelling on, and you could influence people's time of day when they choose to drive. If that were the case, I think you could have a very significant influence through demand management in that way. Sorry, Peter.
Prioritisation.
How do you prioritise between projects? How do you finance in a way that gives the right incentives for people to use the infrastructure?
I mean, arguably, I think one of the ways to prioritise between projects is to focus on the ones you can deliver and not waste a lot of time on trying to deliver things which are actually going to be almost undeliverable and put all your energy into that when there are other things which are more likely to obtain public support and therefore are more likely to be delivered. But I mean, fundamentally, the other challenge we face in this country, and it's a tricky one, is balancing the economy. and this constant challenge of the expenditure in the south and expenditure elsewhere in the country, and what prioritisation do you give to that? Now, people may well accuse us, I suspect, of having ducked that in this report, in that we've tried to please everybody. So we've said, yes, we must continue with Crossrail 2 because of the massive benefits that can flow from that in continuing to ensure that London remains a driving force in the economy. But equally, we have said that interesting, Chris Grayling said that he thought that Crossrail 2 and the rail improvements in the north should go forward in lockstep. Our interpretation of that is a more financial one, is that we should, and we've said, allocate 24 billion of funds to that transport improvement in the north. So let's see similar levels of funding which we allocate to Crossrail to be allocated to the north. The challenge of that is, in fact, that if you look, and this is a reality which I think we have to face up to in this, if you look at the next 5 or 6 years, there isn't any spare money. The RIS2 for highways, Network Rails, CP6, those monies are essentially spent, allocated. They take up a very large proportion of government funds which are available for infrastructure. Therefore, you can play around at the edges, but the real impact of our report is post-2025. And that's where we're saying that there needs to be a greater redistribution of funding across the country. And we've actually taken money away, which is caused some debate, from Highways England and from Network Rail, particularly post-2030, in order to create funding for example, for maintenance of highways, which we see as being a priority. And we've said 500 million a year needs to go from that. The only place we can find that 500 million is by reducing the budgets available to the strategic road network. These are sort of choices which I think have to be made and faced up to. There is a limited pot. It's why we can't walk away from private finance. Government cannot afford to do everything. And therefore, we've got to continue to find the right incentives and the right arrangements to ensure that private finance flows into all the other types of infrastructure in the right way. And as I agree totally with Stephen, we shouldn't throw the baby out with PFI and other types of financial initiative. We should learn from the mistakes that we've made in previous contracts and previous arrangements and improve on it and get a better one next time. And then a better one after that. You just don't give up on something which is so fundamental to the delivery of infrastructure as private finance. You just have to find the best ways in which you can bring it into the system.
Thank you. Sara, any final comments for you?
Just very quickly, in terms of prioritising, I think it's about understanding the full benefits you're trying to achieve, not just taking that narrow approach to these, having more confidence in the funding models. In terms of final comments, I hope very much that this report gets the widest possible debate. I mean, as far and wide as it can go, because I think there's a real opportunity here to open up a better understanding of this and the need for that longer term approach.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'll finish it there, and I'm sorry for all those who didn't get a chance to ask a question. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you in particular to our panellists, Sir John Armitt, Sara Drake, and Stephen Hammond, and a particular thanks to the Association for Project Management for sponsoring today's event. And for those who haven't had a chance to read the other big report that has been released recently, can I please recommend that you do so? It's available on all good websites. Thank you and goodbye.